Canberra. Greg Jennett and Jane Norman with you for the next little while.
Yeah, and Greg, over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll take you through some of the major debating points. The federal budget's really in uncharted territory now, deep in debt and deficit. But what would change if the current government was elected or a Labor one installed on the 21st of March? The answer, Greg, really appears to be in the messaging.
It does. I mean, they're strong. Let's start with the two characters involved here, Jane. Both serious politicians, serious about the jobs they've been given. Candidates for Treasurer. One currently is, one would be. And let's face it, within their own parties, should they be re-elected, there is often surrounding both Jim Chalmers and Josh Frydenberg talk about future Prime Ministership. So they come prepared. They know their numbers, but what did they throw on the table today? Which is new or different? The answer, Jane, alas, not terribly much at all. So we got a real consolidation of the message. In Jim Chalmers' case, talk about wasted opportunities, a full-blown budget and cost of living crisis, he says, whereas from Josh Frydenberg, you know, aspirations to keep steering us beyond the pandemic, back into budget restoration of good health, continue cutting taxes if at all possible. I mean, that's real Liberal heartland stuff. So, yeah, certainly few surprises. Yeah. I think that much we could conclude.
That's right, and I think there's a real continuation of the message that we have basically been hearing since the start of the election campaign, which is that the coalition is asking voters to trust it with the economy, whereas Labor is saying, you know what the coalition's offering and, you know, blame it for the current circumstances we find ourselves in, which is one of rising cost of living, rising interest rates, while wages growth has remained stagnant. So it was those two competing messages that we heard today. But as you say, no sort of new policies or new offerings put on the table. No,
very much on message. I think that would be fair to say. Why don't we, before we go to our political editor, Andrew Probyn, who you would have heard was in the room there, we might just revisit a section of the debate today. Yesterday's interest rate rise, of course, sharpened the focus on the dominant theme. We've already discussed that, Jane. That is the cost of living. Here's how Josh Frydenberg and Jim Chalmers framed the debate in what was their opening statement of the debate.
The defining issue of this election is the full-blown cost of living crisis which has emerged on the Morrison government's watch. And it didn't just show up when Russia invaded Ukraine. It showed up when the coalition, the best part of a decade ago, started attacking the wages and job security of Australian workers. And neither a war in Europe in 2022 nor even a pandemic explains or excuses what has been almost a decade now of economic mismanagement.
Our future economic plan for the country, a plan that I laid out in a budget just a matter of weeks ago, a plan that delivers cost of living relief now, halving the fuel excise, ensuring that the lower middle income tax offset has been lifted by $420, seeing 6 million pensioners, veterans, others on income support, carers get $250 cheques in the mail, and also ensuring that our medicines are more affordable for more than 2.4 million Australians.
All right, so they were the bits they pre-wrote themselves because it was their opening statements. So that kind of framed the debate, didn't it, Jane? And then from there, the journos really did do their best, but you could almost sense the exasperation towards the end that none of them seemed to feel like they had really cracked through. Even Andrew Clennell, Sky News reporter, tried to switch up the tactics out of pure frustration.
Yeah, took an unconventional approach by basically offering the two an opinion on what the other would do should they win after May 21. But I think, and we'll talk to Andrew Probyn about this, but one of the major frustrations, I suppose, from the journalists was that we know that the budget is hurtling towards this structural deficit, which we'll explore, but neither side at this, you know, very close contest, I should say, is really willing to say how on earth they're actually going to address that. It has to either require cuts to spending or increases to taxes. Neither is a particularly big vote-winning strategy.
Exactly, and depending where you stand, them being so rigidly on message is either a good and disciplined thing or intensely annoying if you're a journalist looking for news. One such person is our political editor, Andrew Probyn. He was at the Press Club. Let's go to him now. And Probe's overall impressions, Jane and I are already adding our 2 bobs worth. Nothing particularly new, but what stood out?
Well, look, it was a very civilised affair, but it was hardly revelatory. These are not truth-telling missions at all. In fact, the best truth-telling we can expect in the next few weeks will be on election night when one side or the other loses, and we really hear what they think of themselves and the others. Look, so when it came to the questions, I must say I thought that Andrew Clennell's question was the best one. Forget about trying to get some answers from either of them. Go to what it is they say of the other, and that was where you heard the cut-through line, be it about from Jim Chalmers, we can't have 3 years of the same. And Josh Frydenberg's answer was, well, should they win, you'll see their true colours, which with high spending and high taxes. So I think that's about the sum total of it. But look, I think that they both like and respect each other, and that was the general tone.
Yeah, Andrew Probyn, you can certainly see the coalition continuing its kind of fear of the unknown here with Labor. But I wanted to ask you about another moment that stood out to me during the debate, and that was when Josh Frydenberg, he's trying to tell voters that he knows the pressures that cost of living is placing on them, but he's basically accusing Labor of pinching his policies in the budget. Did you sense there's an element of frustration there that, the coalition doesn't think it's getting enough credit for these things?
Well, that speaks to the Labor Party tactics, doesn't it? It wants to both criticise the spending and the level of spending, but when it's come to the election campaign and some of the cost of living measures that the government has introduced in the budget, it supported those wholeheartedly. I think that the best moment for me was actually from Jim Chalmers when he was going to the attack from Josh Frydenberg, where he was talking about how it would be Labor who'd be testing this tax to GDP cap. Now, it's a boring subject, guys, but
you can make it interesting.
OK, I'm going to make it interesting. In essence, the coalition says that what happened under John Howard, the peak of John Howard was 23.9% tax to GDP ratio. That's the maximum you should reach. Jim Chalmers says, well, if that's the case, the only people who've actually breached it in the past 30 years is the coalition. And so this is an issue because it's all about economic management. This is an issue that goes to how well you spend your money. This is an issue that goes straight to the heart of the accusation against the Labor Party. And I thought Jim Chalmers handled that one really well.
Well, it might be seen as a little arcane, but since you're taking us there, Andrew Probyn, why don't we actually revisit a little section of the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer talking to this very issue, because no government's ever thrown more at a single spending measure, since we're talking about spending and taxing, as the Morrison government did with the JobKeeper initiative. Of course, it was only one part of the record spending on the pandemic, but as we move, Jane, from that pandemic, the argument now turns to, well, what exactly was wasteful, what was necessary, and what extra spending had the opposition argued for and presumably would have spent if they were in government. So why don't we revisit now that moment in the Treasurer's debate, then we'll go back to Andrew Probyn.
What we are seeking to do is to end that emergency economic support, and we were criticised by Jim and his party for doing so. I mean, JobKeeper, the COVID disaster payments, we were criticised by Labor when we brought that spending to an end. What we want is the economy to normalise, and that means ensuring that we focus on the things that will boost the productivity of the nation and will create more jobs. Tax relief, investing in more roads, investing in water infrastructure, investing in telecommunications infrastructure.
This is a government which has spent more, taxed more and borrowed more than the last Labor government, but delivered much less. And that's because the budget is absolutely riddled with rorts and waste, and that's why it's heaving with $1 trillion in Liberal Party debt. So what Katie Gallagher and I have said is that immediately, if we are elected to office, we will audit the wasteful spending in the budget, the rorts in the budget, to try and get the budget on a more sustainable footing so that the spending in the budget, the investment in the budget, delivers a tangible economic return.
All right, well, that was Jim Chalmers there, and we'll bring Andrew Probyn in again down at the Press Club. Oh, no, he's gone from that screen. We'll just wait until we get him back up the Press Club. But Greg Jennett, hang on, sorry.
Why don't we just pick up on that point, because wastefulness is often in the eye of the beholder, isn't it, Jane? So Jim Chalmers has this policy. I think it's been on the deck for, 4 or 5 days, losing track of time. They announced it last week in Canberra. And it's one that says we'll go back to Treasury and Finance in office and say, can you run a ruler over all of the grants and the discretionary spending? They seem convinced that the budget is littered with such waste. But a question does arise, since you're asking bureaucrats and departments which were somehow involved in that process, whether they are prepared to critique things that they've had their hands on. So is there a pot of gold for a would-be Labor government to scrape up, reuse and recycle? We don't know. And somehow you get the impression maybe an Anthony Albanese government doesn't quite know yet either, but they're banking on some saving.
Yeah, and of course they're referring to programs that have had a hell of a lot of scrutiny, sports rorts, community car park schemes. These are the kind of schemes, grants that Labor is preparing to crack down on. But again, the quantum of this apparent waste is sort of unclear at this stage. And we might just take you back to the debate for one moment, because you wouldn't normally expect a question about dogs and dog parks to illuminate the differences or similarities in spending promises from the government and would-be government. But that is the way a wily question from the Nine newspapers' Shane Wright went to the issue of waste and quality of spending. He asked why the Coalition and Labor are each promising to fund dog parks in different electorates. The answer suggests the line between potential pork barrelling and sensible spending is a blurry one.
There is a problem in the budget with spending in politically motivated ways. Now, our commitments are typically working with local governments or state governments or others to make sure that we're getting maximum bang for buck, which should be the test. There will be commitments made by all parties around Australia. The key is to make sure that we get value for money for that. There has not been enough value for money in the budget the last almost 10 years. That's why we've got these stupendous levels of debt.
The Labor Party is always holier than now, even though I think the same paper found that the Labor Party were providing small grants and a whole range of targeted seats. And we do know that the Labor Party, in which Jim Chalmers was a shadow finance minister ahead of the last election, also had a park and ride scheme. And Bill Shorten was going out and promoting it and making announcements ahead of the last election. And they are about projects to get more people onto public transport. But with respect to local community programs, they'll always exist. They have always existed and they will continue to exist. But our focus in the lead up to election day has been making big announcements, all of which the Labor Party has simply copied us. So this is the Labor Party's strategy, a small target strategy to forget about their addiction to higher taxes.
And that was Josh Frydenberg there, touching on the point that we raised earlier about a sense of frustration you could pick up from Josh Frydenberg about Labor's tactic, and perhaps a successful one, we'll see, of effectively matching coalition promises. But let's once again bring in our political editor, Andrew Probyn, down at the Press Club. And Andrew Probyn, I mean, why was there such a big focus today on spending from the journalists' questions? It seems to be one that neither party is really comfortable answering.
Well, let's go to the NDIS, for example. When the NDIS was a proposal came forward from Scott Morrison, 2017, he had a proposal to increase the Medicare levy, like Julia Gillard did 4 years before. He said at the time, or a year later, we can ditch that because we've got a lot more money coming in. This is pre-pandemic. We're now in the tail end of a pandemic. The financial situation is ruinous. Whoever wins on May 21, we have $1 trillion debt. We have a budget that is in structural deficit. That is, we're spending more than we actually get. And that structural deficit runs right through to the 2030s. This is the big challenge for whoever is Treasurer after the election. And we didn't get any answers today, none. But the truth is that they'll have to come up with they'll have to come up with an answer, be it extra taxes, better spending, finding some golden pots of money, which simply don't exist if you've got the NDIS running at $70 billion. So there's a lot of tough work to be done, and that is only going to be revealed after the election, I think.
Yes, it's going to be a hellishly complex outlook for whoever wins that election, as Andrew Probyn points out. It's just gone 2 o'clock in Eastern Australia and 12 noon in Western Australia. We welcome now to our coverage viewers on ABC main channel in Western Australia. This coverage being some post-analysis wash-up from the Treasurer's Debate held in Canberra today at the National Press Club between Josh Frydenberg and Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Jane Norman and Greg Jennett with you today, and we're talking to Andrew Probyn, our political editor, who remains down at the National Press Club. And then on the question of interest rates, you know, the grenade that was thrown yesterday by the Reserve Bank Board, Andrew Probyn, that of course framed a lot of the questions today, but like a bouncing ball, it always goes straight on back to cost of living, at least as far as Jim Chalmers is concerned.
Well, interest rates have had to increase because inflation has got completely out of control. We had Philip Lowe last year, the Reserve Bank governor, who was insisting that interest rates might not go up until 2024, when the market said completely something else. The market was saying there was going to be a whole raft of interest rates this year. There might be some frustration inside there will be some frustration inside government ranks that wasn't heeded, and instead he's delivered this 25 basis point increase to interest rates, which is going to cause all sorts of pain for Scott Morrison and his government. It's also given a great opportunity. Very noisy people behind me. Excuse me. Simon.
It's off-putting. It's a noisy place to be, Probes.
It is off-putting. Yeah, he should know
No
better. He's got experience in media too. The point here being that this has given a great golden opportunity for the Labor Party to talk about cost of living, to talk about who's to blame. The reality is, of course, there's a lot of international factors at play here, be it the war in Europe, the pandemic, COVID supplies and the like. So lots of pressures on the government here, but the Reserve Bank has not helped matters by delaying its action so long.
Andrew Probyn, if I have a think about the past week of this campaign and some of the external events that have had pretty big seismic shifts, I suppose, one would be on the Solomon Islands, and the second would be on interest rates. So you've got the RBA lifting interest rates and the Solomons signing a deal with China. To what extent do you think this is like undermining the coalition's key election pitches, that a coalition government will keep Australians safe and that a coalition government, you know, has the better plan for the economy, as they say?
Well, if you said at the start of the election that we would have two significant players in this election, and they're not Anthony Albanese or Scott Morrison, who would have thought it would be Manasseh Sogavare and Philip Lowe? Well, some might have guessed that Philip Lowe was going to play a part. He's, of course, the Reserve Bank governor. The other is the Solomon Islands Prime Minister. Those two men have been involved in shots amidships for the Scott Morrison's government. We've got, on the one hand, national security credentials through foreign policy being undermined by Sogavare's deal with Beijing. On the second, we have Philip Lowe, who has sparked all sorts more interest in cost of living through his interest rate hike. And there's going to be a lot more of those later this year.
Andrew Probyn, you've got a bit more work to do, and I suspect a few ears to go and clip down at the National Press Club. How dare people speak over you in your important work with us this afternoon. We'll let you go. Did you notice his authority, Jane Norman, when Probes shouts them down? A silence did descend across the room.
That's some serious power from our political editor over there. Well, Greg Jennett, I suppose we actually need to move on to other issues of the day. So we thank Andrew Probyn